Hello everybody, you have tuned in to Eric Jose on Making a Murderer on YouTube. I cover virtually any aspect of making a murderer. I go over the evidence, the documents, the photos. So if you like, stay tuned, and in the future I'll have many more videos besides the one you're about to see. How you doing everybody? We're here today to do a little call with Mr. Hoddinott. I love talking to Mr. Mark Hoddinott. He sees, a lot of the funkiness and the things. He sees right to it, and that's kind of what I like about him. And he's very, very reserved, and he doesn't tend to go off half cocked. He's kind of methodical, and I it's one of the things I like about Mark. And like I say, he's always very knowledgeable about the case. He's always got some smart observations, and so I always very much enjoy my calls with him, just like I do with my other friends like Carla and Paul. And I look to be adding to that list, by the way, folks. So those of you out there in YouTube land or in Facebook land or whatever, don't be surprised if I ask you one of these days. Not saying I will, but could happen. Carla Garcia probably didn't think she'd ever be doing a video with me, but she did. So anyways, let's get on to the call with Mark right now.
That's
cool.
Good.
All right, there we go. When in doubt, reboot.
Correct. Exactly.
Well, when it comes to electronics,
that's what we're hoping. That's what we're hoping the courts will do. Reboot. When in doubt, beyond reasonable doubt, reboot. New trial.
Yeah, there you go. That's what they're trying to get from Melissa Kalyazinski.
Yes, that was interesting. Listening to Kathleen Zellner present her thing in front of the court.
Yes, her oral arguments before the Illinois Appellate Court. Yeah.
Yes.
Cool stuff, man. It was interesting watching her in action.
Yes, very, very interesting. I'd be tempted, and hopefully it'll happen if the Supreme Court accept Brendan's case. I'd be tempted to go over to Washington and sit in on the day just to hear her.
Go do that too, man. Just to go to the oral arguments for Brendan, that would be awesome. But I imagine the line will be long.
Yeah. Oh God, yeah. Can you imagine?
Yeah. I don't know anybody big enough in the government to be able to get a seat. So let's see. We were talking about Brendan Dassey, right? We were talking about we were talking about the fact that his case is not only profound in terms of juveniles and juveniles with kind of limited mental capacities, but it's also what's called ripe, and the case is actually ripe, and that is what's good. It's something that's actually a good thing when you're trying to get before the Supreme Court, is that your case is ripe. And what that means, and anybody who remembers from the brief, it was talked about in the brief where they were petitioning for Brendan's writ of certiorari. In that writ, they're talking about the fact that the case is ripe. And the reason why is because juvenile interrogations and especially juveniles of limited mental ability and that sort of thing is a kind of big deal right now. Lots of states are beginning to, it's taken a while, but they're all starting to record interrogation. Some of them are going as far as to record every adult interrogation as well. I mean, so this is becoming an issue. So therefore, it is ripe, and that gives Brendan more oomph, in his hopes to be heard by the Supreme Court. So,
indeed, and as I think I've heard you say before, this issue about the percentage of wrongful confessions or false confessions from juveniles
limited mental capacities, basically, yeah. And that was in the Innocence Project's amicus brief for Brendan, which there were 6 amicus briefs for Brendan.
Yes.
But that was in the Innocence Project's brief, and the number was 8 of 10 of, so basically of all of the wrongful convictions that are known of to date. When it comes to juveniles of limited mental capabilities, 8 out of 10 gave a false confession. That's a staggering number, people. That's 8 out of 10. That's 80% of all of those juveniles of, somewhat limited mental capacities that gave a false confession. And that puts Brendan's confession really in the proper light. I would say a whole new light, but what I really want to say is it puts it in the proper light. So,
and it definitely goes to your point about this whole topic being ripe,
yes.
Because putting Brendan's case aside, he's just almost, dare I say, the poster child of a whole lot of other symptomatic problem matters associated with confessions.
Right.
And particularly in lower court, either willfully ignoring them, willfully ignoring the Supreme Court instructions on these issues,
right,
or just through a lack of capacity to understand what's going on.
Right.
I'll mention something later. We'll talk about it just briefly later about Jerry Buting's book, this book.
Right. I have my copy. I just haven't gotten around to reading it yet.
There are some interesting stats in there as well about the degree in which lower courts, especially appellate courts, basically won't even look at whether a matter is deserving of reconsideration.
Right.
And when a matter goes to final determination, be that at the Supreme Court or some other level, 85% of those, I think it is, I'll check that number a bit later, but 85% of those ones that ultimately get determined to be wrongful convictions were rejected at the lower level.
Right.
So that tells a lot about how appropriately or otherwise the lower courts are handling appeal-based matters.
Yeah, exactly.
They're trying to wrap them up. They're trying to say, let's put this to bed. We don't need this to be going over this old ground again.
Right.
So,
yeah, absolutely. It's being ignored, and that's kind of the whole point of what they want. What Brendan's case can do. Hopefully, the Supreme Court's going to hear it, and hopefully, the Supreme Court's going to go ahead and thump the state courts and the district courts and all that, and the circuit courts. They're going to thump them and say, look, this is unacceptable with youth, especially youth of limited mental abilities. This is unacceptable. We've said it numerous times, and you all need to get in line. They just need to be thumped, and that's what the Supreme Court really needs to do. It's ripe. It's time. It's the right case because it's drawn so much attention. Overturning of Brendan Dassey's conviction will, echo across the country. It will not be a silent thing. People will know it happened. It will be effective. So that's why I think that the Supreme Court should take it. They should take it up, and they should reiterate their past, decisions, and make these courts give special care where it's supposed to be given, and not cursory, brushing over, barely considering, types of things. Because like I've said, before in other videos, when the appellate court, which is what the state and everybody's hanging their hat on, even the Seventh Circuit majority were hanging their hat on the fact that the appellate court mentioned age. Well, it didn't mention it in the evaluation of the confession, which is where it most matters. It didn't mention it there. It did kind of touch a little bit on the mental limitations, but no mention of age there. But mention of age far later in the summary of argument.
Yes.
or the summary of whatever, the decision or whatever, and in the summary of that decision or whatever, that's when they mention he's 16 years old, far away from where they were evaluating the confession. So I mean, that's a valid point.
Yeah.
How much special care are they giving it if they forget to mention the fact that he's 16 years old? I mean, that and how all these things come together to require special care. And so I mean, there's no evidence of special care is my whole point. So anyway,
no, like, and in the giving of evidence, we have, if you take scientific evidence, we have all these protocols that scientists should follow, albeit in Stephen's case, a lot weren't, but nonetheless, where there is, if you like, a point of view, a philosophy, an approach that says you have to be prescriptive about how you do things. It can't be just arbitrary. But in the case of special care, where is the prescriptive process that demonstrates special care? There should be a prescriptive process that sort of ticks the boxes, that is brought in, and you can then say, okay, this young man who was 16 of limited intellectual capacity.
You should be required to say why you think this person who so obviously fits the mold of somebody who can be coerced. I mean, my opinion, you're right. I believe they should need to show their work as to why that doesn't apply here. I mean, that should. So in the case of Brendan Dassey, they should have been required to explain why special care doesn't apply to him, or something. Should be some kind of explanation as to how they came to their decision, instead of just whatever it is, So
because the prescriptive approach is something that you can then judge. You can then say, okay, I did this, I did that. I made sure he had counsel present. I had someone to evaluate his psychological and capacities, and then
he had no previous contact with law enforcement. He was never in any real trouble growing up. I mean, these are all factors.
And as I say, when a scientist evaluates a DNA sample or any other scientific, they have scientific method. It's called scientific method, and this is the science of special care. Where is the method?
Right.
It's and there's no method. It's like people are less important than biology, right? Brendan is deserving of appropriate scientific method that backs up either that they gave him special care or they didn't. Well, clearly they didn't. But and they've got nothing to support their assertion that they did.
Yeah, I agree.
And if a scientist said, "Oh, there was DNA on that key," but there was no scientific method to show how they went about measuring it, how they went about collecting it, how about the custodial chain, that would just be thrown out. There was nothing there. But no, it's good enough for just to say, "Oh, we know he was 16, and in the passing commentary somewhere mentioned that he's of limited ability." I mean, that's just garbage.
Right.
Anyway, I'm on my soapbox. So
I see. I see. As you. I mean, I see no evidence of any special care that was given, and unfortunately, part of AEDPA is that lack of or failure to mention or write in the decision what it is that swayed you in terms of the confession or whatever. That's not required. It's not required to be there. The AEDPA is fine with even if that's not there, whatever, we don't care. If the trial court said, then we're gonna back that up. That's almost basically what AEDPA is.
Yeah,
it's effectively writing habeas relief out of the books in terms of confessions. That's what those minority judges at the Seventh Circuit said after the majority's decision. That was their comment on it, is that it's effectively removing habeas relief from the books for in terms of confessions. So I mean, that's an amazing thing to say, but they are in a position to make that observation. So
okay, so I guess the core part of our discussion is about the podcast.
Yeah. So everybody that may have noticed, Carla Garcia and I had a little chat last night. Well, we actually had it a couple days ago, but I uploaded it last night. And we talked a lot about this podcast that was put up on iTunes called Conspeared. And that's basically like the name of the podcast. They have, I think right about now, they have about like 5 or 6 episodes. One of those episodes is about an hour and 5 minutes, and it's the Stephen Avery case and what was left out of MAM. Which to me is my big bone to pick. I can not begrudge somebody for having the opinion that they're guilty, that Stephen or Brendan are guilty or whatever, and I can usually move past that. But what I'm always keen to do is if they are talking about the evidence that was left out of MAM, you're talking about what Ken Kratz came out with in December of 2015, right after MAM was released. You're talking about the list that he came out with of things. Okay.
Yes.
Well, that should give you pause alone. You should not want to just run with that information because it's obvious Ken Kratz misrepresents things. It's his way. He spins. That's what he does. He just spins constantly, spinning everything so that he can make it look the way he wants or can get closer to what he wants, right? So
yes.
That's the way he is. And for anybody that hasn't seen it, just check out the press conference that Aaron Keller does with him when he was exposing the sexting and the forceful sex allegations and stuff with Ken. And you watch Ken spin constantly. He's like, he takes things that Aaron Keller says. Like Aaron Keller says, well, she says that you texted her 30 times. He's like, oh, Aaron, are you serious? How can you even bring this up here? How can you even be asking me about this? How can like, and he's like constantly turning everything around. Like, oh, who gave you this information, Aaron? Was it one of those people over at the wherever, somebody obviously that had a beef with him, that had a beef with Kratz? He was like, oh, was it somebody over at this department or whatever? Like trying to mess
deflect
me up politically, basically. And Aaron's just like, wait, whoa, because he keeps attacking Aaron. Aaron's like, whoa, dude, I've done my homework here. I talked to this lady. I talked to this girl. She, I've seen the texts. I've seen it. I'm asking you for your side of it. And you just see Ken Kratz continuing to just spin and try to put guilt trips on Aaron, all this stuff. That is Ken Kratz. That is the essential Ken Kratz, folks. That is his way. It's the way he's wired. He is just hardwired to be that way, to be dishonest, to be loose with the rules in order to get where he wants to go. So that is Ken Kratz.
And then relying on, without your own independent verification of information such as that, is the problem. In fact, my problem with the podcast, the lady Natalie, and I think the man, is it Gerard? I can't immediately remember. Jerry. Okay. Now the podcast was labelled I mightn't have the exact words right. What was left out of the documentary?
Right.
Okay. So there was, if you like, a focus on that, and that's fine. But the fact of the matter is that, as in evidence in your discussion with Carla, that they went, and I think particularly Natalie went and almost just cursorily went and picked up information she found online and presented it without verification as being true. Now, this is not the way. If you're going to do something serious and you want to actually be regarded as a serious presenter of information, you need to do your homework.
Certainly.
And okay, we all make mistakes. I mean, I've probably said a few things that was factually perhaps not perfect, but as soon as I found out, I would correct it, right? But nothing as significant as some of the things that were going on in the podcast. But So I'm not suggesting we can't all make mistakes. That's fair enough. But there was just a whole catalogue of things that they were saying and not refuting. I think Jerry didn't refute them in any significant way, probably because he didn't know either. Mm-hmm. So they were picking up pebbles and going, well, this is true. Well, that's not journalism. That's not. It's not a throwaway line from someone on Twitter or Facebook. It's meant to be a professional. They're a professional, or trying their best to be a professional public platform for opinions on a whole range of things, a lot of which are the paranormal, which is kind of a bit interesting in that sense.
Yeah.
Because
that's what
there's
Jerry's
a lot
there for. Jerry's there for the
there's a lot
conspiracy and paranormal stuff.
And there's a lot of paranormal characteristics about some of the players in that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Aliens,
Narnia.
That's right. Anyway, but look, my criticism is that they picked up pieces of information and clearly had not done their homework to verify whether that was true or not.
Right.
That was bad enough, and that was pretty painful if you're fairly familiar with the case like I am and you are and many other people are. That was kind of painful enough. In fact, as I was listening, I'm thinking, do I have to keep listening to this? But I did, out of respect for what they were doing.
Yeah.
But they got
some
to
of
the
it, I mean, not to interrupt you, sorry, but I mean, some of what they were saying, I mean, they were kind of cutting both ways. And that's the one reason why I was able to kind of, but the problem was when they started cutting the way I didn't like, they were doing it using the King Kratz line of bull. And that's what really got me. I was just like, no, you can't use King Kratz's line of bull, and this is why. Because
look, I don't mind if they say things. What I don't like is not the factual side, it's the professional side or the lack of professional side in the way they do it.
They're new.
I would say if you're going to start off by saying at the outset, this is just a personal opinion, we haven't done our homework very deeply, but we're going to come to a personal opinion at the end about what we think, and we accept that it perhaps is flawed in what our opinion is. Okay, you've created the context for your statement, but at the end they come to a conclusion that was not at all based upon any deep understanding of the facts of the case, but there was no real acknowledgement that that was true. And also, to Jerry's credit, when Natalie was sort of ticking off the issues about what was left out, he had an answer for a lot of the things, a counter answer for a lot of things that she said, but she didn't try to argue her position. She just she went on to the next one. And she'd say something, and then he'd say something, she'd just go on to the next one.
Right.
I mean, that just shows you the shallow foundation upon which those points were made. Now, that's fine, except don't make it out like it's some sort of authoritative presentation on the facts of the case. It's not. And it undermines their credibility as presenters when they don't do their homework, unless they give it the caveat that they haven't done the deep research to support it. And if you haven't done the deep research, the best thing they should have done was to invite someone like, for example, yourself or other authoritative people to come on and discuss the issues. So they created a discussion.
Certainly, yes.
That would have been a more credible way that would
But I would say that one thing in
bits.
defense of them, Mark. One thing, and your suggestions are brilliant, and I agree. But here's the one thing. I'm 2.5 years in at this point with my little, or 2 years. So these guys literally just started in like February. So they're kind of new kids on the block. So for me, I think they may be learning as they go along here. I think they may have learned something from what happened on Twitter the last 2 or 3 days. I think they may have learned something. They may have blocked all you guys, but I think I still think they may have learned something.
Well, let's hope we're all capable of learning.
Moving forward, especially if they watch my video, because they didn't block me, I was able to share my video with them. And so hopefully if they watch it, they're going to see those documents that I put up there that clearly prove at least 3 or 4 of the things that King Kratz says that MAM left out as completely bogusly false. But I would argue that talking about the sweat, we're up to 4 or 5 of those things that I think are provably false. But there was a lot of argument on Twitter about opinions and skewing things, right? So, in the interest of not skewing anything, I give you the documents, folks. I gave you I gave in the video that I just did. I'll leave the link for my call with Carla down below in the info, folks. But in that video, I get a document from the Department of Criminal Investigation of Wisconsin, DCI, Wisconsin. Okay, you can try to tell me I'm spinning all you want, but the problem is that I can't spin DCI. I can't make them write on the paper what I want them to write. And what that paper says is that there was 2 calls, 2 voicemails left on October 31st. One of them was at 1:40. It was from a lady who was wanting to inquire about how much it would cost for a family portrait. And the second one was from a guy named Dan, who was from some kind of color lab, obviously probably something to do with development of pictures or getting some chemicals so that she could, you know, for her dark room or something. I'm imagining that's what that's about. But that's it for the 31st, folks. Those are the 2 calls, and they're not Stephen Avery. And that proves, no matter what you want to say about spin, that proves he didn't call. That proves Kratz lied about it. Hands down.
Yes. And just on, I mean, I won't go through all the detail because that's already been done. But just on the issue of, the so-called Stephen greeting Teresa at the door of his trailer in a previous visit in a towel, right?
Yeah.
Well, firstly, I'll just ask those who want to question this just to go to the pre-trial evidence, okay? And the whole issue of the phone calls and whether Teresa was afraid of visiting Stephen Avery, etc., is totally debunked by in-court testimony by Teresa's work colleague, who that was subject to the ruling of Judge Willis, that basically said she testified in a conversation in court to a conversation that referred to discussions about somebody who had done that, not that it was Stephen, right? Stephen's name is not mentioned at all as the person doing that, but just put that aside. The court said that in respect to those matters and the matters of whether Teresa was afraid of visiting Stephen, it was totally without foundation and ruled as inadmissible. Any of that pre-trial testimony could be used in the actual trial. The court decided that was just debunked, and that Teresa had been out to the Avery property many, many times after the supposed incident with the towel, even though that wasn't attributable with evidence to Stephen. And on the day of this particular visit, she knew where she was going. She knew it was on Avery Road, and the testimony in front of the judge confirmed all that. So, you talk about Ken Kratz's spin. He takes an event of some obscure purpose, rolls it into a characterization of Stephen Avery as some lurid person that Teresa was scared to go and visit, and all of the evidence, not just the speculation, all of the evidence.
He was luring her. Yeah.
And all the evidence and evidence presented in front of Judge Willis before the trial, in the pre-trial hearings, debunked all of that. But Ken Kratz, and with respect to Natalie and Jerry, take that and present it as truth. I mean, this is not what journalism should be about.
Right.
This is not truth. And do your homework and find out whether things are true or not.
Yeah,
or if you don't have the time to do that, present the caveat to your commentary to say, well, we got this information from what such and such had said, but we haven't verified it.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, that's counterintuitive to a short, punchy little podcast to get into the boring stuff of that. But if you can't do it, if you don't have the homework on the books yourself, drag someone else in, or maybe 1 or 2 people in, and interview them and make your podcast around people who do know the facts.
Yeah.
That's my criticism of the podcast. Not the intent, not the enthusiasm. It's just they didn't do their homework and they needed to be called out for it, because you don't want people like that who are making an effort to bring things to the public's attention. You want their credibility to be enhanced, not to be diminished.
Right.
And when you don't do your homework, it actually goes, well, would I watch another one from them? Well, I would actually, in my case, because you don't judge one person's results on one matter. But I hope, like you, that they have learned that they need to do that type of thing a little deeper in the future.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope, like I said, I hope they watch the video that I posted for them today. And I hope they look at it, and I hope they see those few things. Because, I mean, Teresa wasn't afraid. Stephen never left a voicemail. That didn't happen. You know, vials of sweat, ridiculous. There's no, I mean, that's all deception by Ken Kratz.
Yes.
The reason why, to get into the whole sweat thing here, the reason why, because I did it before, but they had to cut it out. So, the whole thing with the sweat is Ken Kratz comes out after MEM talking about they found sweat DNA under the hood latch. Okay.
Yes.
He actually says sweat DNA, folks. He knows. In his brain, he knows there's no such thing as sweat DNA. He knows this. Okay. He says it anyway. 10 years after the case, he says sweat DNA. Okay. The reason why, in my opinion, is because he knows that using that terminology will pull at the heartstrings of particularly people in the area of Wisconsin where this happened, so that they'll all remember the press conference and the rather violent and gruesome imagery that conjures up. And so that's one purpose of him talking about sweat DNA and talking about how, do you believe that officers were carrying around little vials of Stephen's sweat? So the reason why this is important, and it's because by him saying that, he gets everybody going, oh yeah, that's ridiculous. How could they be carrying around sweat? Where would they get it from? That's ridiculous. Yeah, you know, and he therefore gets some people to think Stephen's guilty on that. But the thing is the sweat has no DNA in it, so you could have a freaking swimming pool full of it. Doesn't mean that you're going to have much DNA there. You might have some in it somewhere in that pool, but it's not like DNA is just going to be swimming all throughout it, because sweat doesn't have DNA.
Yes.
You know, it doesn't have it. So that's why that's a ridiculous statement. Couple it with the fact that Ken Kratz knows it's a bogus statement. He knows that sweat DNA doesn't exist. He knows that and says it anyway, because he knows the effect he's going for. And here's the other thing. By getting everybody looking at how ridiculous it would be for officers to be carrying around vials of sweat, Stephen Avery's sweat, he detracts attention from the swabs that could actually be used to incriminate Stephen, namely the buccal swabs that Zellner's experts have basically theorized. The labels were switched when they were on their way to the Madison lab in Madison, crime lab in Madison. So they think the labels were switched. The buccal swabs and the hood latch swabs labels were switched, so that the buccal swabs went as hood latch swabs and the hood latch swabs went as the buccal swabs, you know, basically, or whatever. So who knows why they ever needed those buccal swabs, because they should have had plenty of Stephen Avery's DNA on record at this point. So who knows why they actually needed more. But then there's the buccal swabs, but then I mean, it's such a strange story. There's an incident where they collected some groin swabs from Stephen and then threw them. Then one officer came over, somebody, I can't remember who, came over and said, "Oh no, you can't take those. You can't. No, you don't. You shouldn't have collected those or whatever." And like they get thrown in a trash can, and that's it. That's the end of it. They're done. They're bye-bye. Right? No, fuck, they're sitting in a trash can right there. Or anybody and their brother. Wendy Baldwin leaps to mind. Could have came up and grabbed them and done whatever with them. So it's like you see all this careless, you know, kind of things going on. And it's just like, you can't tell me this is all just innocent. that all this crap is happening, that all this fishy crap happened all in one case, and this, you know, the state had to spend so much money, more money than they've spent on any other case. And was, I mean, Avery's like the top, or it's like number 2 in like the money spent to get the conviction. So I mean, that's a freaking staggering number. You know, so you got to think about all these things. Why was so much money needed to get a guilty man?
Yes.
Shouldn't a guilty man kind of just
be guilty?
Yeah, be guilty, and you don't have to spend a whole shit ton of money to, you know. Sorry, trying to watch the language here, but you don't have to spend all that money, right? If they're, I mean, if they're guilty, it's a much simpler process. You know, like, yeah, you just show the evidence. They're guilty. There you go.
Yes.
But not with this case. No. The price tag went through the roof. So
exactly.
You just gotta wonder why. These are all things that just make you go, as Arsenio Hall used to say, things that make you go,
Exactly.
So
yeah, it's oh God. I mean, these issues about chain of custody and proper process, you know, the issues associated with Sherry Culhane, the DNA expert, how she handled or didn't handle things properly, how she didn't document things properly.
The defense couldn't be there. The defense couldn't be there for the testing of the bullet. Well, yeah.
Yes.
Was it, the bullet. And the defense couldn't be there, but she had like students that she was training there. Well, it's good to know. It's good to know that students, you know, that have very little, you know, experience, you know, with litigation and everything, were able to be there to foul it up. You know, too bad it couldn't have been the defense. At least then you'd have somebody else to blame it on instead of yourself, right?
Right.
If they had let the defense be there, anyways. It's ridiculous,
but, you know,
that she allowed that to happen. It's just absolutely ridiculous. But go ahead.
You know, and even just on other related issues like the bullet fragment found in Stephen Avery's garage, right? Yeah. So, found under the compressor, I think it was from memory. Well, that whole compressor, I mean, there's testimony that says that compressor and all the other bits and pieces in that garage were all moved once before in previous searches.
Absolutely.
You know, so if it was moved before, how was it hidden? And let alone the whole issue, which we've covered many, many times, about the lack of dust on the bullet when the whole place was
it's actually sitting on top of the vein of concrete dust.
Yeah.
Like it's, you know, because you imagine if it had been there for a while, it would have been settled in. You know, like everything would have shook around and it would have like settled into the dust. It would have been like almost maybe partially submerged, you know, or something in the dust. But it's not. It's like sitting right on top.
And guess what? Yeah, Mr. Caterer, James Link, bringing the sandwiches across, happens yet again to be present when a key piece of evidence is found, who should not have anything at all to do with this case by virtue of conflict of interest. And Jerry Pargle's statement of that this was the only time we needed them, that was back in November, I should say. I mean, that's it beggars belief, as I've said many times. So. And, you know, just to go back to the podcast, all I would say to Jerry and Natalie is the criticism of your podcast was well-founded, but it's not a criticism of discouragement. It's meant to say, you know, do the homework. And if you don't have the time to do the homework, question the merits of what you're doing, or bring in some other people who can be your support knowledge bank to give credibility to the point you want to make. Now, you don't have to make points that please everyone. I'm not saying that. I don't care whether you come up with a conclusion that I don't agree with, but I want to see a sustainable, arguable position that says that is the basis for that conclusion you've come to, not just throwaway lines from ill-researched information.
Right. Yep. They certainly do need to, you know, probably do some more research. And like I say, tackling the Avery case is one of their very first things, probably was probably not the best thing. But the thing is they're just starting out. They wanted to talk about something that has a lot of attention to help them when they're starting out. I mean, I as a YouTuber and as somebody who started basically from the bottom too, and what it was like building up to the point I am now. I mean, it didn't happen overnight. It takes time for people to trust you, and to really give you, their attention. It just doesn't happen immediately, and I think they are still learning, what works and what doesn't. I think they're still in the process of maybe making a few mistakes here and there, and kind of realizing, okay, maybe we don't want to go off half-cocked anymore or something. I imagine they're going to come to some realizations, because they clearly didn't enjoy what happened on Twitter.
No.
They clearly did not enjoy what happened there, and so I'm sure they would like to avoid that. They seemed, even though they were presenting that knowledge that they hadn't really looked up, but they seemed pretty reasonable to me when I was listening to the podcast.
Yeah, I didn't get any sense of vindictiveness or it wasn't that type of feel to the presentation. I thought the presentation style was fine. It was just the foundation facts weren't researched, and the conclusions therefore were ill-founded. Well, founded on a very rocky base, put it that way. So.
Yeah. So.
Hey, I wanted to, if I could, hope I'm not jumping ahead, just talk briefly about Jerry Buting's book.
Yeah, go ahead.
If that's all right with you. Yeah. I might just give you a little very brief summary of the book, because I don't want to spoil the book, because it's well worth the read. So I'm not going to try to take away the need to read it yourselves. But the book is told in a very interesting way. It obviously engages throughout the book with the Avery and Dassey trials, and see Dr. Pepper's there. Good on you, mate.
Yeah. I realized I was pouring it next to the microphone, which would have probably not been so good.
That's right. Sounded like I won't tell you what it sounded like. Sorry about that. Yeah, so the book's told. It's a story in many ways, a bit of a biography of autobiography in a sense, not totally, of Jeremy Buting's life, about how he came about to be a lawyer, and also he intertwines this issue of the illusion of justice with Stephen Avery and Brendan's trial, along with another important trial in his life to do with a gentleman called Ralph Armstrong, who was ultimately, I won't go into the detail, was convicted of a crime, a serious criminal activity of murder, and spent 29 years in jail before he was released, in large measure by Jerry's efforts. And that case was still going on in part during the time he was representing Stephen. And post Stephen's trial, I think he was ultimately released in 2009 after, I say, 29 years. So he uses that case and Stephen's case to talk about the imperfections of the justice system in the US, and also relates it specifically to some personal issues about his life and his background and so on, and how he came to be a lawyer and how he came to ultimately set up permanently in Wisconsin. And Jerry himself went through a serious bout of cancer. Back, I think at the beginning, it's first known at least at the beginning of 2000s, and of the year 2001, perhaps it is. And he was like on the edge as to, he had a form of cancer that the survival rate was extremely low. So when you interpose those personal issues in the book with the issues associated with the justice system, it makes for an extremely compelling read.
Right.
But I wanted to, if I may, and forgive me if I look down and read this, I wanted to just mention a few things that I'll just quote from the case. And he talks about some research. I think I just mentioned this previously. In 86% of cases, no appellate court found fault with the original trials, or if they did, they declared it to be harmless error. This is talking about cases that were ultimately turned into exonerations. 86% of the appellate courts, the lower courts, didn't find any fault with the matters. I mean, therein it lies a problem. And preceding that, he says, indeed, some courts hold that actual innocence is not enough to warrant a new trial. I mean, it's pretty scary when you think about that, right?
That's a scary statement. That's absolutely a scary statement.
Yeah.
Oh,
so,
terrifying.
and he says a lot of things like that. That he also talks about, the influence of money or the lack of money. He says, I've often thought that people without my education and means, without my support systems of a strong family and loving wife, without a community that embraces them, might not fare so well in a similar situation. That's referring to his personal challenges of his cancer. This is also true of defendants. For those without education and means to hire an expert legal team, without the support system of a strong family and loving spouse, without the support of their community, the deck is stacked against them from the start.
Right.
These are interesting reflections on his history. I think he's been doing it about 30 years now. I think about 30 years, maybe a little longer actually. He also talks about the positions associated with judges, selecting judges, and the fact that judges are voted on rather than appointed. Right. And I'll read this little piece. But as important as elections are, they have proven to be a very poor way to pick judges. Some favour judicial elections over judicial appointments by their governor because they fear political partisanship or corruption. However, the practice of judicial elections exposes candidates to the pressures of fundraising, pandering, and other perils of political campaigns.
Yeah.
These races are becoming saturated with money from special interest groups, particularly on the appellate level. One alternative is to select judges using a merit-based panel and then requiring that they stand for a retention vote after they have served a term on the bench. So that's an interesting point. So he's suggesting there that the judges should be appointed to start with, and then after a required period be subject to a vote to see whether their actions warrant them remaining there.
I wonder if Jerry's ever considering becoming a judge.
Yeah. The world would be a better place if that was the case. There's a long section in the book. Actually, interestingly, Jerry's last chapter is aptly referred to closing statement. That's what he calls his last chapter. Right. He says here, I'll just state this. A question I get asked repeatedly goes, do you really think Stephen Avery is innocent? Yes, I believe Avery is innocent. This is my opinion, which I know is not worth very much, but my opinion is based on an assessment of the evidence. Note, more important to me is one of the real questions posed by Making a Murderer. Could anyone have come away from that trial without reasonable doubt about Avery's involvement? If the answer to that is no, the jury should have found him not guilty. We don't have a verdict of innocent. It's guilty or not guilty. The state's burden is to present proof of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. If the jurors had any doubts, they should have found him not guilty. He then goes on to talk about many things. One of the things, of course, is the question of who did, if it wasn't Steve, who did kill her. And I won't go into that too much, but basically in his book, Jerry does refer to the if you like, the potential witnesses without naming them, of course, and the fact that Judge Willis prevented under that procedural matter for them naming anyone.
Yes,
alternates, the Denny issues. So that was an important point in the book, that Stephen had a huge burden to prove his innocence, but they couldn't. The state had very little. Didn't even have to establish a motive for Stephen doing what they alleged he had done. I mentioned previously about the issues of the sweat towel thing and all that jazz. So I won't repeat that. But one final thing I'll mention in the book is as an example of Jerry himself. He says here towards the end, however, there aren't always as many, talking about guilt and innocence, however, there aren't always as many indicators of a client's innocence as there were, at least to me, in the Stephen Avery case. At cocktail parties, people often ask me how I can defend people who I know are guilty. In truth, at a personal level, it is easier to defend someone I know is guilty than someone I believe is innocent. I could screw up, I could make a mistake, and because of me, an innocent person could end up in prison. The pressure of representing an innocent person is grindingly intense, and which gets you inside. In fact, this is probably, this book gets you inside the whole thing that, when Jerry and Dean would go home after court, or they had an apartment in Appleton, or they had 2 apartments in Appleton, and how their days would unfold and how they would deal with things. I mean, this book is a fascinating insight into being a defense lawyer, obviously in a very high profile case. Yeah. But really goes to the heart of suggestions for criminal justice reform. So I will thoroughly recommend if you get the time to have a good read.
Yeah, absolutely. I have it. I own it. I just haven't been able to get around to reading it.
Could I just say one other quick thing? I noticed my battery on my device I'm using is getting scarily low, so just bear that in mind. So I'm not sure what it is, but it's around below 10% anyway. So
yeah, we've probably got another couple minutes. So
okay. So anyway, that's my view about the book. I think it's a great read. Obviously, there are events that are going to happen soon. There will be the responses, if you like, to Brendan's petition at the Supreme Court, which I think is due sometime in May.
May 10th, I believe it is, yeah.
And it feels like something's, I don't know, this is not based on anything I can prove. It feels like something's going to happen soon with Kathleen Zellner and Stephen's case. So
I hope so. Yeah. Sandra Greenman keeps throwing little stuff out there, so I'm like, I hope so. I hope so. I want to see it.
So. Yeah. Right. Well, that's about it from me, my friend.
Okay, buddy. Well, it has been a pleasure.
With you.
Got to talk about some good stuff.
Yes. And we fight on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Soldier
All
on.
the best.
Alrighty, bud.
Take
Have
care.
a good one.
Oh, by the way,
What's that?
One other quick thing.
Uh-huh.
Any other commentary about control questions at all that you want to add?
Ah. Oh, you want me to talk about the belly button piercing? So, all right, I'll talk about it a little bit.
No, I was only joking. That's it.
Well, it is worth talking about for 2 reasons, actually, real quick. Number 1, if she had one, it should have been found with the bones, because it wouldn't have melted or burned away. And the other thing is how it pertains to exactly what you're saying, the control question. Because if we have Brendan being asked about a fake tattoo on her stomach, and he says no, and then Tom Fassbender says, "Do you disagree with me when I say that?" And suddenly Brendan goes, "Oh," you know that Brendan suddenly got scared and was like, "Oh no, I don't disagree with you," because he thought that would be the better answer. But in fact, it was not what Tom Fassbender wanted. He just agreed to a fake fact. And in all of this, Brendan never says, "Oh, and she had a belly button piercing." Yeah. Never says that. So it's like he's agreeing to things that aren't there, not mentioning the things that are there. It's further proof that the control question was complete bogus crap. So
yeah,
but there
crap
we
with
go.
a K, crap with a K,
Absolutely.
by the way. So
Yeah, with the king crap. KK.
yeah,
so yeah, that's I do kind of pound on the control question quite a bit because it pisses me off so much, especially
yeah, and
after the
validly.
Seventh Circuit majority used it to bolster themselves. I'm just like, how is this? Are we in Bizarro world? They just used him flip flopping on the question as a reinforcement of their decision. Yeah. Anyways, I swear I'm gonna go down to the local college to the English department. I'm gonna find maybe hopefully 2 or 3 professors that I can get to sit down in front of a camera and say, listen, here's what we're looking at. What do you think about the mechanics of that English that you just heard in that conversation? And I want to just have 3 English professors, or 2 or 3 of them, just sit there and go, well, first he agrees that there wasn't one, and then he's asked if he disagrees with the investigator about that, and to which he says no, he doesn't. So he essentially flip-flops. I mean, if we got to have an English professor explain this, because clearly the Seventh Circuit majority doesn't know, because they put it in their decision. So I'm not confident in the Seventh Circuit's majority, in the Seventh Circuit majority's English skills, comprehension, and reading skills. Although it should be extremely high, being lawyers and the amount of briefs and things that they have to read, I have to assume it should be very high. Yet, they're, clearly misinterpreting that. So this is like something that stands out like a sore thumb, folks, because it's not true. It's not a true representation of the facts. So
yes,
it's worth mentioning.
And I'm glad you did.
All right.
All right, my friend. You take care, and
you have a good one.
And
we'll see you again.
Talk again soon. All right. Bye now.
So that's it for my call with Mr. Hoddinott. I know all good things must come to an end, but anyways, if you haven't already, please hit subscribe, and we'll see you.